Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. I'm a past member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee, and currently I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering questions, connecting you to resources. To tell or not to tell? For many people with MS, that is the question. Disclosing to family and friends that you've been diagnosed with MS is a deeply personal decision that can cause considerable stress and anxiety. We're joined today by Dr. Victoria Leavitt, a clinical neuropsychologist, researcher, and assistant professor of neuropsychology at Columbia University. Dr. Leavitt has conducted several studies exploring how people with MS approach disclosure decisions. Welcome, Dr. Leavitt. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, John. I'm happy to be here.
Well, let's start by talking about the research that I just mentioned. Can you tell us what the purpose of these studies was, who was involved, and I guess most importantly, what you discovered?
Sure, thanks. It's a topic that I'm very passionate about, and I'll tell you how I became interested in it because I think it's a kind of an interesting story. It was about 7 years ago, and I was at a dinner, and I had the pleasure of hearing a man named Ken Bandler speak about his own experience of keeping his MS diagnosis hidden for over a decade from his professional contacts, from his close friends, from his family members, even an aunt who herself had MS. And he told one particular story that got me, as a cognitive neuroscientist, thinking. He said, sometimes I would sit at my desk in my office and I would wonder whether I could make it across the room to get across the office to get a cup of coffee without tripping or stumbling. And I found myself thinking, wow, that's a lot of mental energy around should I or shouldn't I get a cup of coffee? And so I began wondering about what's the consequence of that. You know, this is an allocation of neural resources. We need our brains all the time to be doing the things that we want to be engaged in doing. We can't be stopped up by, should I get a cup of coffee? And that's really what set me on this journey of understanding this topic. And the more I talked to patients about it, the more I found that it's really something that everyone deals with. I almost said almost everyone, but I do think everyone deals with it, regardless of how comfortable one is with this diagnosis. There are still choices that have to be made all the time. And those choices have personal and professional consequences. They are ongoing. It's not a once and done issue. It's not like you decide to tell the world and then you're done. It can keep coming up. So the studies that we did were really to quantify the burden of disclosure and concealment issues. So those are two separate things. One is, do I disclose? When, how, and to whom? And the second is, am I concealing? And do I anticipate both positive and negative consequences? So we created a measure. We call it the DISCO, disclosure and concealment. And we deployed the DISCO in 3 separate studies to upwards of 500 people. And we found that around half, a little less than half of people do actively conceal their diagnosis. And about a third of people do anticipate negative consequences of diagnosing. And we looked at that in both professional and personal spheres. We broke it down all sorts of ways. We also looked at things like demographic differences. We found that people who are younger and who have less disability are more likely to conceal. We think this makes sense. It's kind of like if you can keep it a secret, you do keep it a secret. But we also found that keeping it concealed is associated with higher anxiety and higher depression and loneliness. So it's a funny kind of combination of factors that start to crop up where you have people maybe feeling a little bit separate and alone in what they're going through. And that's something that as a psychologist, I definitely want to address where we see it.
You mentioned that about a third of your study participants indicated that disclosing their MS would bring about negative consequences. What types of consequences are people afraid of?
I think there are practical consequences, right? In the workplace, people are worried about job security and how that might be affected by disclosing that we have a disability. On a personal level, I mean, there are so many anecdotes that I could share. One of my favorites is one of my patients who's very, very open about his diagnosis. He's literally a poster child for MS. And yet he recently got divorced and now he's dating. For the very first time, he's dating with MS. And so he's having to make decisions about, on which date do you share that? There's no guidebook for that. So that would be an example of the types of consequences that people consider. Also, though, there are positive consequences of disclosure, right? There's a huge community. Here we are together as part of it, a huge community of support around MS. There are fun things you can do with MS. There are walks, there are runs. You can run up the Empire State Building in an MS-sponsored activity. So disclosing can bring about a whole new world of MS supporters.
We heard from Mario, and he just told us that it's been 6 months since he was diagnosed with MS. He's wondering how he'll know when it's the right time to tell others about his diagnosis. What can you tell us about the right time?
So that's tricky. And I want to be very respectful of the fact that these decisions, as soon as I start talking about this research topic, people say to me, what's your advice? What do you tell people? And the answer is, I try to do less telling and more listening, because I think it's a very new topic that we don't know that much about. One of the survey respondents wrote us a little note at the end of his survey, and he said, "It's funny because this issue is a bigger problem for me than any other MS symptom, and no doctor has ever talked to me about it." So that, for me, that really brought home that this is something that deserves our attention and that hasn't gotten it yet. So going back to Mario's question, my first thought is he's 6 months in. There's so much going on. Let's put this off for later. Let's save this. He has to learn to navigate the world in so many different ways. So to relieve the burden of when do I tell people, let's wait on that. Let's let him get a little bit more comfortable and understand the ins and outs of what life with MS is going to be before we tackle that one. But it is a lot to think about, and I'm glad he's already thinking about it.
When someone decides that it is the right time to disclose their MS, do you have any tips to share about what they should share with other people?
So again, it's very personal, but I will say one of the things I've really enjoyed learning from my patients who describe different scenarios to me that really never would have crossed my mind. One thing that a lot of patients have brought up with regards to disclosure is that while you, as the person disclosing, feel as though this is about you and you're managing your own emotions, as soon as you disclose, all of a sudden you're managing somebody else's emotions. People, I think we all know that people are quite unpredictable animals, and some people burst into tears. All of a sudden, the person with MS is consoling them. This is complicated. This can bring about different feelings. So I guess anticipating complete uncertainty with how your news is going to land is important. Also, another thing that patients have described to me is feeling sort of disappointed after sharing with somebody and then having that person never again ask them about it. It's a very weird thing. what I've come to believe is that human beings really aren't equipped to deal with things that they don't understand, right? We can be loving, caring people, but we don't always know how to treat others with love and care. We just don't know. So your friend who you've shared this with, and it might have been painstaking for you to open up to, might then never ask you about MS because they're imagining that that's how you want it to be. So I think, I hate to say the burden is on the person with MS, but elevating ourselves to new levels of empathy for the imperfections of humankind is a part of this whole journey.
As you've already mentioned, concealing an MS diagnosis can take an emotional toll on a person. So can you take us through some of the upside of disclosure and how it can actually help someone feel better?
Thanks for that question, John. I appreciate that because it's hard to know that as the person who's debating. And I've asked again and again my patients, do you wish you hadn't told, or do you regret having told? And literally no patient has ever said to me, yes, I regret it. I really wish I could take it back. No one's ever said that. Now, that's not to say that it hasn't come with new complications, but I do have the sense that the burden of keeping a secret is greater than the downside of sharing it. I do have that strong sense, and that's anecdotal. That's not something I've quantified in the laboratory and researched. One of my patients said it really beautifully and poignantly when she said to me, you know, Dr. Leavitt, the thing about a secret is when you have a secret, no matter what it is, it becomes your dirty little secret. And I thought that was really interesting, right? There's nothing dirty about having MS. There's nothing little about it either. But it's having a secret and keeping a secret that can make us feel ashamed. And so that's a burden that I don't want people to have to carry. And people need to know that they don't have to carry that.
We heard from Rachel. Now, she told us that several years ago, she told her college roommates about her MS. They assumed she was faking her illness. And since that experience, Rachel's actually stopped disclosing her MS to others. So maybe you can take us through the potential downside of disclosure and perhaps suggest the best ways to handle these negative situations.
As trite as it sounds, right? It's live and learn, right? Because again, everyone is going to surprise us with a reaction that we never anticipated. I actually have a patient with a similar experience as Rachel. And for her, it was a teacher who kind of accused her of slacking off and faking it. And it's so painful that she still talks about this today. And this happened decades ago. And so the way that people respond to us can affect us deeply. And there's no getting around that. And there's no tips or tricks for getting around it. But I think we live and we learn, and we learn to forgive. We learn to forgive others for their insufficiencies. People, I think, are scared. And sometimes their reaction is driven by that. So I think that people with disabilities scare people without disabilities. And that is a sad truth. And that's something that comes up with this whole disclosure issue is, again, like, it's not the person with MS anymore. It becomes the person with MS managing the other person's feelings around MS, which really should not be yet another burden on the person with MS, but it is.
Darius told us his parents are elderly, and he's hesitant to tell them about his diagnosis because they have health concerns of their own, and he doesn't want them to worry about him. Any advice for Darius or someone in his situation?
I had a patient just like Darius, and I'll even take it a step further. My patient's mother had MS. And my patient said, I don't want to tell her. I don't want her to know. She was very old. She looked like she might not be with us for much longer. And this patient's decision was, I'm not gonna put that on her. And I'm in no position to say you should, or you could, or you would, or why wouldn't you. This is a very personal thing, and we protect the people we love. Actually, I'll take a moment here to say the people in our lives we have complicated relationships with, and we protect them in multiple different ways, which is where sometimes a support group can be such an amazing outlet. A support group is a bunch of people that we're not working to protect. We're not working to protect their feelings in the same way that we are people in our lives. So I do really recommend support groups to people with MS. It's a place where we can all be ourselves. We can open up in ways that we don't with the people we love, not because we're keeping a dirty secret, not because we're deceitful, but because we want to protect them. We don't want to necessarily put our burdens on the ones we love. But it's a lot to carry on our own. So I do recommend finding an outlet.
We heard from Tammy, and Tammy's wondering if she should tell her young children about her MS, and if so, how to have that conversation with them.
That's a tricky one. Something that I've also talked about with patients. I had one patient actually who was pretty distraught that her daughter seemed nervous and scared, but didn't know what was going on with mom. And in that actual instance, I invited her to bring her daughter with her to the next appointment, because I said, look, let's have her here so that she sees where you're going when you're going somewhere mysterious, and what's going on, and what your doctors look like, and how they talk to you. And I think kids always know more than we think. If they don't know it, they feel it. And we do need to protect them from that, because things always seem scarier when they're unknown to us. That said, it's important to gauge how much information a child is equipped to process. So we have to protect them in that way too.
Now, if a parent doesn't want others outside of the family to know about their MS, how do they help their children understand that they need to keep that information private?
This is a question that I have a really hard time with. And it's very personal. I think it has to do with overarching lessons that we teach our kids about what's family information versus what's public information. And a lot of how I answer this question also has to do with what developmental stage your kids are at. So we have to gauge the information we dispense and how appropriate it is for the age of our kids. And when can you tell your kids this is information only for our family versus not? That's a personal choice.
We heard from Laura, and her ears perked up when she heard you relate another anecdote. Laura tells us she's single and she's dating. And she says dating is challenging enough as it is. And Laura isn't sure if and when she should tell someone about her MS. Are there guidelines that people might use when they're deciding to disclose to someone they're dating?
John, that's the $1 million question, and I've posed it to many groups of people. One of the studies we did was called Disco Talk, where we brought together people with MS into groups on Zoom, and we invited them to talk about this issue. We shared our research with them, and we led them through guided discussions. And this came up again and again and again, and there literally is no answer to it. It's as complicated as the answer to the question, how do you date? Right? It all has to do with trust and mutual respect, and when do you know, and when can you sense that? It's an unanswerable question. I think one of the things I'll maybe circle back to later is that a part of the answer to all of these questions is find your team of support and ask them for help with navigating these challenging decisions. Your team of support is people you trust, people you respect, and it's too much to try to figure out all on your own.
Social media is a platform where people share information and very often overshare information. What should someone consider before they disclose their MS in a social media post?
I guess the same things you'd consider in sharing anything in a social media post, right? It's like there was this analogy in a movie. It's like going up to the top of a rooftop with a feather pillow and sticking a knife into it. Just imagine where those feathers go after that, right? Once you put something on social media, you have no idea where it's going to go, and it can't be taken back. Depending on how comfortable you are, I might advise against doing it at all. But, if you're an advocate for the MS Society, or if you're advertising that you're excited to do the next MS walk, of course you want to tell your friends on social media. So I guess just understanding that you don't know where it's going to go and you have no control over that. And if you're fully on board with that, post away.
Telling people at work about an MS diagnosis may be one of the most complex disclosure decisions someone actually makes. What are some things people should consider when it comes to disclosing MS in the workplace?
This is especially tricky. And I have a heartbreaking story that I'll share, which I think brings home how it can be tricky. One of my patients was a school teacher, and she did not appear to have MS, and she was very, very happy in her teaching position, except that she needed her classroom to be closer to a bathroom at some point along the way, and she could no longer not ask for that. And so she went and she asked for it, repeatedly asked for it, and finally she disclosed, "This is the reason I'm making this request." Shortly thereafter, she was let go from her position. Now, this seems like a clear infraction of the American disability laws. But what did she do? Did she sue the school district? Did she get a lawyer? No, she just went and got another job the next day. And that's because what she wants to do is teach, and what she's good at is teaching. And so that's what she did. But it's heartbreaking that had to happen. And so that's something to know, right? It would be easy for me to say, look, disclose and get what you need and ask for what you want. But we live in the real world where things are not always fair. And so, of course, there can be consequences.
Well, you've shared some great information with us today. What would you say are the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our viewers to remember?
So the first one, I would say that I think by now I've come to appreciate that this is such an important issue for every patient with MS. It comes up in some form, in some iteration, that it's useful to spend some time thinking through what your own disclosure and concealment issues are, sort of sifting them and maybe sorting them, professional issues, personal issues, just to kind of take stock of where you are and whether any of it is representing an undue burden. Because none of us, we haven't got time for the pain, right? Like none of us needs extra burden. So it's about finding ways to optimize your functioning. And if this is a burden that you can unload in some way, we need to find that way for you. Toward that would come my second point, which would be assemble this team of support. Whether your team is a team of 1 or 2, talk to somebody. Find somebody that you can hash this out with a little bit, whether it's a friend, a doctor, a clergy person, somebody in your life that you respect and trust and that you can share with to just help you bounce these ideas off of. And finally, and a related point, put in place a plan that will help you alleviate any stress that you might be feeling around disclosure and concealment issues. And it could be, anything can be a plan. It can be, I'll think about that another day. That's a plan. It can be, I'm going to start telling people one by one in my life. That's a plan. One of my patients, I love this actually, she said, I have a huge family and I have one cousin who's a blabbermouth. And I told her, and I knew that I was done at that point. She told everybody I didn't have to do another thing. And that's exactly how it worked out. So your plan is very individual. It's very much specific to you and your life. And finding that plan can be a piece of reducing your stress around this.
Well, I want to thank everyone who submitted questions, and thank you, Dr. Leavitt, for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Before we close, I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups. You'll hear about ways to get involved, and you'll learn about upcoming events that are taking place near you. Remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that we start here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Dr. Leavitt for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webcast will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webcast is important. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to a survey pinned to the comments section. And on YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Victoria Leavitt and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.